Okay, so I've just looked at that last introduction. Um, I'm not used to this, and I'm pretty technologically inept, so it's just going to be pretty minimal. Just me talking to camera and seeing what I can do with that. Um, what am I going to name this video? Um, this is going to be a kind of personal history to some degree, and particularly in the realm of poetry. Um, as I said very briefly in the last video, I started writing in my mid-teens, and so I think I just want to talk in this video about what kind of poetic growth there was in my life. I'm now in my early 40s. So, to one degree or another, I've been involved in the writing and reading of poetry for a quarter of a century. And I don't know who I'm aiming this video at, really. I think, generally speaking, it would be directed at people younger than me. But if it's of use to anybody else, then any other age groups, then that's fine. I wonder, given that I'm very interested in shamanism and kind of metaphysics, I wonder in the pathways of one's life we are led to the things that shape us and that fascinate us and that we have a natural enthusiasm for, together with, a certain amount of humility about how good we are at that thing that our soul is kind of binded to in a way. Throughout our life, people have natural propensities to a multitude of disciplines and interests, and I guess I'm just saying we need to be in touch with those things. I think in the modern educative framework we're in 2020, it's quite tricky for somebody going through their teens and into their mid-20s to actually find what is their enthusiasm, their basic enthusiasm, or enthusiasms plural. And until I hit my mid-teens, I didn't know. I had no idea that poetry would be the thing that interested me the most. I look at the world through the lens of poetry, if you will. It's kind of just it's a form of perception, I guess. So in this video I'll try to give you a little bit of a timeline of my life, with that one basic discipline in mind. I did have certain creative instincts when I was younger than, say, my mid-teens. I would say 16. I don't know exactly when I got interested in poetry very specifically. I think children naturally are very, very creative, and they love drawing and even play. Just the natural play of children is a kind of creative and imaginative act, and it's very special, and it needs to be honed and appreciated. And if it is, then I would say if those creative instincts are encouraged, they don't just affect that individual personally, create cultures and civilizations, whatever we could define as a civilization, I would say, is a result of that early encouragement. So when I was like, I would say 8, 9, 10, I was very creative in a different way. I was a drawer. I loved drawing, and in primary school, which I look back on now, I think actually primary school I really enjoyed. I loved primary school. I hated secondary school. So for the non-Brits, primary would end at the age of 11, 10 or 11, and then secondary is the rest of your schooling. So I grew up in a suburb of Manchester, let's put it that way. And it was kind of a village atmosphere on the outskirts of Bolton. And the primary school I was in was very nice. It was very calm. It was very peaceful. There was not much going on, as with any kind of village type situation. Kids would play, and there would be a lot of football and cycling and skateboarding, and drawing was just something that was quite fun. So this would be mid to late 80s, I guess. So I had that, but I think the real step into poetry was, and as I was hinting at before, I think there is an event, there's usually a person that initiates you almost in a shamanic way into something that becomes very important to you. And in this case, I was in sixth form college, so that would be my final couple of years at my secondary school. And up until that point, I wasn't even a reader, really. I mean, I must have read kids' stories, and if anybody remembers, Agaton Sax was a kind of children's, not totally for children, but it was like adventure stories. I remember reading that. It was a series of books by a Norwegian writer, Nils Olaf Franzen. I think he's Norwegian, don't remember. But I'm just thinking of, whatever the prelude was to my starting to read, because, I mean, starting to write poetry and starting to read were totally connected. I remember going to see some relatives in Newfoundland. This would be towards the end of my secondary level schooling. And I'd passed my exams, not brilliantly, but I'd passed all what I needed to pass. And sixth form college would be the last 2 years of high school in the modern sense. And I chose my A-level subjects very randomly. I just got back from this holiday and I hadn't actually registered for any classes for sixth form, and I wasn't even sure what I was doing. It was all very random. And so I enrolled in sixth form college, and I took English literature, design technology, and you had to give 3 subjects, and the last one was, I chose English language because I figured, I'd always liked literature. I mean, I'd read, I guess I'm lying when I say I hadn't read. I'd read, the stuff that they'd given you at school. I was just a reader of whatever they'd thrown at you, really. But when I say reading, I kind of mean choosing your own books and making that a kind of focus, of your own making, rather than any institution. So I ended up doing English language because I knew I liked literature. But it turned out to be a disaster, actually. I hated English language. I hated studying it. Um, the literature was good. My teacher was good. Design technology was kind of passable. I liked the idea of using your hands and making things, and to a certain degree that was available to us in those courses. But the reason I mention English language is because of the teacher I met on that course. And she was an anomaly for a kind of middle class kid in a half urban, half rural environment, because she was short, black with dreadlocks, and she was obviously friends with other people in the English department, and I don't know how she'd been dragged onto this English language course. I mean, she was obviously teaching English, and she was a very joyful, interesting person, and you didn't get the sense in her classes that it was scripted, or she obviously had to follow the curriculum to some degree, but it was pretty much, a lot of the teaching was very off the cuff, and she had her enthusiasms, and they would come up in the class, and I can't remember the exact lesson. I still remember her name, obviously, Denise Picard. She's probably still around somewhere in the Northwest, I would imagine. I think I've heard she's around somewhere. Yeah, so I think there was just one class where she went more random than usual, and she was just sitting on the desk and chatting to the kids in the class, and we were just average 16-year-olds, and most people don't have much of their own minds at that age and don't really have much enthusiasm for the class. But she was different, and she would hone in on students who were willing to talk about what interested her, and it would often just devolve or evolve into a free-form conversation on various topics, sometimes related to English language and sometimes not. And this conversation got started. I couldn't give any details, but it got more and more focused on what are you reading? What are you guys reading? What are you doing? And I, like the rest of the kids, didn't have any strong feelings about reading or what I was reading currently or anything like that. But it became prescriptive. So because I didn't have any reading that I wanted to do personally, I ended up coming out of that class with a bunch of books that she'd recommended to me. And this is probably the first time I'd been given a task like that kind of met my own pseudo enthusiasm at the time. Before that, it would be the teacher would say, you need this text for this class, and you would dutifully go off and purchase the book. I don't know how they handed out the texts at that time. I think we probably just would have been told, you're going to need this book, and they'll provide it. I think they provided it, and maybe your parents threw in some money, I can't remember. But this was a little different. I ended up coming out of this class. I can't, in my mind, it's a bit murky, because it could have been, in my mind, I may have compressed, say, 2 or 3 lessons into my thinking that I had a big list. I may not have had a big list of books to begin with, but I do specifically remember coming out of the class with, initially coming out of the class with 2 names of books that I needed to look into. And one of them was The Marriage of Heaven and Hell by William Blake, which is quite a heavy book to throw at somebody at the age of 16, probably. And I don't know why she'd recommended that at that time. What in the conversation had made her say, Andrew, go and pick this up. Yeah, but it seemed interesting. I don't know, I can't remember, we're going back a long time. I can't remember exactly what she'd said about the book in the class. But anyway, I remember I had these two books. One of them was The Marriage of Heaven and Hell by William Blake, and the other one was Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas by Hunter Thompson, which was much more of a kind of zany, journalistic. I mean, maybe anybody watching this would know that book as well. I mean, it was just a zany, journalistic, travelogue, druggy, psychedelic book from the, what is it, early 70s or something. And so I had those in my mind. And then there was a specific shopping trip I even remember doing in Manchester as a consequence of these recommendations. But that wasn't just on those two books. There was a number of other books. And I will get to the poetry part of this, but I just want to talk about the books first. So I had those two books, and then there was a more of an extensive list, which I may have gleaned from another class. I can't remember. Maybe, like as I say, could have been a number of classes. So there are those two books, and then a bunch of other books. I won't name too many because I can't remember. There would definitely be books that would be around in paperback, not too difficult to get hold of at the average bookshop at that time. Definitely Aldous Huxley was in there. I don't think she would have recommended anything like Shakespeare, which I was already aware of as a kid. But I'll focus in on The Marriage of Heaven and Hell for a moment, because the shopping trip ended up being at Dillon's in Manchester, a big bookstore. I don't know if it's there now. It's on St Anne Square. And as I say, I had a longer book list, and The Marriage of Heaven and Hell was top of the list. And I think after that class, as a teenager, you're chatting to your parents. I chatted to my dad about, this interesting class I probably talked to him about, and I had these book recommendations and I wanted to go in. So I think he actually just, any parent astounded by a child's interest at school, I think he threw 100 quid at me, or he said, whatever's on the list, I'll take you there and you can pick them up. Actually, I don't remember going with him. I may have just had a bit of fun, a bit of cash for the books. And I went to Dillon's and I looked around for The Marriage of Heaven and Hell and I couldn't find it. But what they did have was they had a thick paperback copy of the complete poems of William Blake. I still remember the cover. It was one of those Penguin classics. And I always want to be specific when it comes to books. You're going to find this when I talk about books. I love them as physical objects, and they're very important to me, I guess, so I can remember all the details. Anyway, this was a Penguin Classics complete poems, probably published somewhere in the late 80s or something, early 90s. How old would I be at this time? This would be 93-ish. So I picked up the complete poems of William Blake, which was quite a challenge for me, I guess, at 16. And I probably picked up The Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and a bunch of other books. Like I say, Huxley was in there. When I say Huxley, he's produced loads of books, as you probably know. So, but the big ones then, and probably still now, would be Brave New World and Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell. Those were definitely in there. The Flamingo, I remember Flamingo were a big publisher of paperbacks, and I remember those covers as well. This is all specific to British people at that time, I guess. I just think of them now more because defunct book covers are kind of interesting when you go back and buy old second-hand copies and stuff. And publishers are always changing and all that kind of stuff. So I started reading anyway. I started reading with interest and outside of the curriculum, and that is just so essential. And then, of course, after a few years, you go back and you think, shit, I should have started earlier. Why did I leave it till that age? I mean, you could read, whether you could understand it, I don't know. The other thing I did, just to mention this as well, it wasn't like she was the only standout person. Like I said, the guy that was teaching me on my English literature class was a good teacher, and he would recommend things, and he did he did do that. But I just remembered her more because it was such a prescriptive act that she somehow rendered up over one or two lessons this list of books. But he'd also recommended stuff as well. So around the same time, I would also be reading or attempting to read. I think some of these books, if I can remember a lot of the titles, they'd be germinating, over time. You would have the name of a book, and just as with people or with spiritual teachers, sometimes something in you says you're not quite ready, you know. And this is worth mentioning. He'd recommended we'd be talking about James Joyce or something, and he'd recommended. He gave me, because I probably didn't know anything about Joyce, and he probably said you should read this short stories Dubliners and Portrait of the Artist or something, and then he told me about Ulysses, and so I had the names probably in the back of my head, but I do remember going to the school library, um, and they had a copy of Ulysses, and I picked it up, and it reminds me a lot of, if any of you are interested in poetry, there's a very good website. It's the Pen Sound website, and on the Pen Sound website, I found a lot of recordings by the American poet Robert Duncan, and Duncan tells a story of when he first picked up a volume of poetry by Ezra Pound, and he talks about reading the first lines and being totally intimidated and mystified by the thing. And I think that was a similar experience I had with Ulysses. And I probably read the first 20 pages of Ulysses. I probably took it out of the library, took it home, and read the beginning of it, and promptly probably put it down after a few days and thought, Jesus, what's that all about? I remember writing down, there's a little squib verse about religion, about Joseph the Joiner, from the first few pages of Ulysses. I can't remember where it occurs, but I do remember scribbling it down in my red binder that I had, which I kept all my schoolwork in. So yeah, that was a name, but it was a bit weird, and perhaps I was reading Portrait of the Artist instead, or maybe some of the early Joyce short stories. So that's kind of the atmosphere I was in. And then it got deeper, because in a later class, maybe only a few weeks or months later, maybe a month later, my teacher, Miss Pickard, was talking about writing, and do you do any writing, and does any of you, she wasn't just aiming this at me, she was just asking the class, do you do any creative writing? And you just draw a blank, because unfortunately the society we live in doesn't encourage this. Perhaps nowadays with other people, I don't know, I mean, it's so personal. I'd like to think that all of your creative propensities are encouraged by your parents. This isn't really a criticism of my parents or my neighborhood, or perhaps there's just a time and place for things to be put in front of you. I don't know. But anyway, the topic of writing was entering the classroom, and she was really kind of talking about, you can read these books, and then you've got this that you can do. You can write stuff. What do you want to write? And does anybody have any writing? And sometime after that, maybe only a few days, I started writing poetry, or at least what I thought was poetry. It was a notebook. I'll be try and be as specific as possible. It was a blue school notebook, a blank school notebook, which somehow I filled very quickly within a matter of weeks. I had a pale blue notebook full of poems, which, as you can imagine, I would subsequently show them to her because she'd already previously, expressed such an interest in the students' writing. I don't know what she thought of them. You could ask her now; she probably might not even remember. I don't. I'm not even sure it mattered what she thought of them. Not because I'm being arrogant, but just because I don't recall and I don't remember any supremely negative or positive responses. It was just like, okay, we'll get on with it. It looks interesting. Keep going. And I did. And I think within the next few months I had a second slightly different shade of notebook filled with more poems. And if you ask me, I don't even know if these notebooks exist anymore. I think one of the shames of my life is that I don't think I have those notebooks anymore. I've rummaged around before trying to look for them at different periods of my life, and I don't think I've found them. I found other notebooks which were more specific to schoolwork, but I couldn't pull them out. They're not with me all the time, or I don't know where they are. But that's probably not much to the point. I didn't know. The other thing is I didn't really know what the hell I was doing, which was quite fun. And that in itself is a symbolic thing and very important, to get into a seeming discipline in life and not know what the hell you're doing. It's just somebody says, it's again, you go back to Duncan, he talks about this thing of permission, suddenly says, somebody comes into your life and they say, this is possible for you, and you either take it or you don't. Or maybe you have it on a back burner for a few years and then you take it up later. But anyway, this was quite back and forth, very easy. Like I wanted to do that and I did it. And so I wrote these little juvenile poems, and it was just very fun. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know anything about rhyme schemes or any of the technical aspects of language, or I just got going with it. And then these things just poured out of me. And I was also, if you look at the bio on the channel page, you'll see that I was also doing a lot of music. I was in a band around the same time, and I was getting heavily into, like rock music, typical kind of teenage rock stuff. And I had my own band, and perhaps it was all coming at the same time. It was all germinating and being produced at the same time, the music and the writing. And I do remember her being at one of our school concerts around the same time. So it was just happening, and I think even with the music I had, within a couple of years, I must have had somewhere between 50 and 100 songs. I was very involved in that, and it comes easy for me now in a different way, but at that time it was just very fluid, happening without much decision making going on, and you're encouraging other people around you, other musicians, and bringing musicians into your life if you know anybody. The poetry is a bit more of a private thing. Even now, I don't know many people involved in poetry, and hopefully one of the outcomes of this channel is that if you are interested in specifically reading poetry, and I think the old cliche is true. I mean, if you're not reading poetry, you're probably not writing good poetry to a degree, and then maybe 2-3 decades roll by and you've imbibed so much that you don't necessarily need to be reading poetry very often. Although for me, I still like reading poetry. I'm much more selective about what I read, and I might do another video about my tastes. I think my tastes in poetry and my tastes in reading follow a lot of my political feelings about Britain and about the world as well. So they'll all be kind of scattered around the videos at different points. So after a year or two, I had a bunch of notebooks, and I remember typing. I do remember typing things on a computer, because I remember having manuscripts of things. I mean, I remember my nan asking me for a manuscript of writing. I can't remember, what are you up to kind of question, and like, oh nan, I'm doing this, so, and giving her manuscripts of writings. I do remember the title. I had a collection planned out. I'm not a big one for publishing. Again, I might go into that later. Maybe I'm just shy. But I never got anything published. You do hear of certain poets just getting started quickly and publishing collections, printing off 100 copies of this book or that book. I never did that, but I had a collection and I had a title, and the title was Realizations of More Than This. And the title kind of went along somehow in my mind with this aspect of the fact that poetry wasn't vital to a lot of people. Because as soon as it hit big in my life, I was kind of looking around and going, why didn't this click for anybody else? I mean, we've got all these names that people know of from the past, like Shakespeare or Chaucer, and we all know these names, but it's not an active principle in most people's lives, and maybe that's rightly so. There are other things I know nothing about that people are fascinated by that maybe I should be interested in. But anyway, by the end of my teens, absolutely, I was totally invested in this idea of writing poetry. And in a way, it's a shame that I didn't put out, a little print run of self-published books even. Nobody had really offered that up to me as an option. They had offered up the chance to write with a pen in a notebook, and I'd taken that. But I don't think without a lot of without encouragement of that kind, I probably wouldn't have thought to publish. Because often these things are to do with your expectance of a readership. I didn't know anybody that read poems. Which is not to say they always actively discourage you either. I mean, I had a friend who was making a CD and he asked for some poems, and I gave him some poems to put in his liner notes or put with his liner notes for his record. So, things like that. And also I recorded some poetry readings when I was at university and into my early 20s. But it was a bug, and I was on that train then, and I knew it was going to be with me forever. And it was something that I could do alone, and I didn't need to. With a band, you write songs, and hopefully, if you're lucky, you have people around you can work on the songs with, and that's more of a social outlet. And I don't want to categorize these things, because poetry should be like that too. And there were other avenues in my life whereby I could do that also. But I still felt that it was something that you can lean on, that's yours, which doesn't really require any social outlet to a massive degree, even if there is a lot of interest there, which there isn't, or at least not where I grew up. So yeah, the social aspect would be yes. So I would go into Manchester to poetry slam readings. It's probably in the mid-90s. I've totally fallen out of that kind of a environment. Mostly because I just didn't like, for whatever reason, what these people were saying and what was on their mind and what was flowing into their poetry. That's not to say that there may be a handful of people locally that are probably doing interesting things, but to find them, Jesus, I've got a kind of earring that's kind of half stuck in my ear. Anyway, it's okay. Yeah, it was a social outlet to a degree, but I wasn't, and it fascinated me for a while. Um, but it's kind of like socializing en masse, with lots of people now. I don't do it whether poetry's involved or not. I still play the odd gig with music, and I'll talk about that in another video, because that's one thing I do for a living, which is busking, which I've done for the last few years, and that's for another video probably. So there is a social aspect to it, and at that time there was not a university aspect to it. That's a very new thing, and again, that might be something for another video. It was purely, if you wanted to find other poets who were doing something, you would go to a pub and you would go to a poetry slam. I think even the slam movement wasn't really going on very much. It was later on that kicked in. It would just be small groups of people. I think there was a pub near Piccadilly train station in Manchester, which had some, like a monthly poetry night. I did that for a while. But I don't really get much out of those environments anymore, and I would like to, in a sense. But as you grow with your poetry, it becomes you, and it becomes much more complex, and it would take a kind of leap of faith to present the poetry that I write now in that kind of milieu. And because I have a certain cynicism that's crept up on me over the years, warranted or unwarranted, about poetry publishing in England, and I was very much invested in the idea of contemporary poetry and finding poets my age, or doing that for a while, and I kind of gave up on it. And the reason I gave up on it was really quite simple. If there was some development in my writing and my reading habits were becoming more diverse and more deep over the years, ultimately I found that there's only a handful of main poetry publishers in England anyway, and most of these collections that came out I would read, and I had years where I was invested in certain writers who were published at that time, who I could logically kind of meet possibly or hear about, but the names fell away. That's probably the significant thing. The poets that I saw contemporary to me, or maybe a decade or two older than me, who were publishing in the late 90s to mid noughties, say, when you're really investigating what other people are doing around you, the poetry didn't hold water really after a while. I didn't go back to the books, I didn't keep reading them. Certain names were constant, and they would be, and again this would be used for other videos, so say Dylan Thomas was very important, and William Blake. I'll probably do a video just on Blake, or maybe even a series of videos on the Romantics, because those poets are very important to me. Yeah, so I would go back to them, and I didn't see that these poets were doing something that I could go back to and get something from. Over a decade of reading Dylan Thomas, you find yourself going back to that writer often even despite yourself, and this is sometimes where the constant influences may be even negative. I don't know. It could be that you get caught up in somebody's writing that is not good for you, or perhaps leads your own writing in a direction you don't need to go to. I often feel that with D.H. Lawrence's poems, which I absolutely adore, a lot of them, but they're nothing like mine. And the influences that you have in writing tend to break down into categories regardless of what you intend. So you would have people that you inevitably find yourself writing like. Initially, that would be copying, because you need the influence, and you need examples, and you need to bounce your ideas off theirs, and inevitably, either technically or just generally creatively, you find yourself copying people, and that's a part of it. But I think even beyond that, when you're self-contained more in your writing, you tend to have people that you have as influences, but you don't write like. And then there are other people you have as influences, um, who you do write like, or perhaps other people could read what you write and say, I see James Joyce in that, or something. I think that's just kind of outside of anything that you would intend, particularly over time. You would consciously intend it for the first 10 or 15 years of your writing life. Yeah. So that's how I got started. I don't know. I don't want to make this video too long. I think it's important to be very as personal as you can be with things like creative writing and poetry. I'll talk more about university creative writing courses in another video. That's a big thing now, or at least it is a thing in British education, whereas it wasn't when I started. And I'm still totally fascinated by poetry, and maybe the social aspect of it, finding people who are recording their own poems, and they're good poems, people recording their own very, very good or possibly great poems. That would be something to see on a public video channel on YouTube. It's funny about poetry. It always slips through the cracks. If you yourself are watching this and you're involved in it on a daily or weekly or monthly basis, your thoughts, your being kind of is centered in that kind of a form of writing. You won't find it difficult to hear me say, there's not much poetry on YouTube, There is some, naturally, and there are lots of talks and presentations on writers, yes. But somehow it always kind of slips through the mainstream. That could be another problem, is some of the contemporary poets imagine themselves to be radical because of poetry's constantly slipping through the cracks of the general awareness, and they're probably not as radical as they may think, some of them. But it slips away. It's not easily available. I mean, obviously, if you disagree with me, throw some links at me. What have I seen on the internet which I really enjoy? I've mentioned Pen Sound already. I think you have to be very picky about Pen Sound. I mean, there's a lot of poets on there, and I would say a good handful personally have been very useful to me. There was another shift in my consciousness with poetry would be more like through the mid-noughties towards maybe 2009-10, where I was really listening to the audio on Pen Sound, and because I was in a British mindset or a European mindset, I really wasn't aware of it, and so my development has been slow in that way. I was born in '77, so I would say I was only reading in poetry very widely, even in English language poetry, by the time I was kind of in my late 20s. I'm talking about current or recent poetry, poetry produced in the last 60 or 70 years. Pen Sound is very good for that. If you're interested in beat poetry or American poetry, you would like that site. I think there's another one. There's a British one that's almost a corollary to that. I have friends that could tell you the name of it. I'll try to put it under this video, or there are a few sites, British and American, that have poetry on. But YouTube, it's not really a visual medium, poetry. So I mean, I'm either in the very wrong place or a very right place, but no one else is doing it if I continue to put a lot of poetry online on YouTube and BitChute and places like that. Rilke. I've searched a few things by the German poet Rilke on YouTube. One of my favourite poets. Some videos of American kind of, you would say, established poets from the 20th century. So somebody like Wallace Stevens or Ezra Pound on YouTube. So it's there, but it's barely there. It's just on the edges of the mass awareness, and perhaps that's where it should be. Pound, what did he say? Poets are the antennae of the race. They are, if we could say, prophets. They are the ones with their finger on the button. Maybe it's very weird to say that now, because social media in the last 10 years particularly has become such a massive force for people that even if you repeat that thing by Pound, I wonder if that quote sticks with people, because poetry doesn't. I mean, there are poets on Facebook and social media, but it barely scratches that type of awareness of the last decade. So, I don't know how far people would agree with that. I think Pound was right, though. I mean, if you find a great poet or a very good poet and you hang out with them, those are the people who know what's going on, and that's like a shamanic thing. If you want to know what's going on, don't pick up a newspaper. Find a very good poet. If you're lucky, you might find one. And if you're putting yourself out there to a degree, which I'm not a good example of, perhaps you will find one. And, they're the misfits, I guess, to one degree or another. They're hanging out with the mystics and the philosophers and the autodidacts and all of these people that are on the internet to a much bigger degree than the poets, maybe. But it's interesting. There's just one other kind of topic about poetic growth and development I wanted to mention before I finish, and that is stages of development, the way you perceive your own development in writing over time. I think I actually had it good for those first few years. William Blake says that, I think he says something about there's no development. You look at your life falsely as a timeline and you take stock of it. But since time is not linear, I think this would be in Blake's mind anyway, it's not particularly linear anyway. Just take the fact that, when you're joyful and happy, time passes quickly, and when you're depressed, it's kind of slow and it drags on. That's the usual stock, position for just from a quotidian angle on the linearity of time, but is there any growth in a poet? I think it's important that a poet sees a linearity and sees poetic growth in his background, and is his or her, I guess, and can give you a summary about the stages of development that they've been through, or the enthusiasms and the writers that they've had as influences and then given up or returned to. There might be some value in talking about that. Whether ultimately it matters in the judgment of somebody reading you in 100 years, if you're lucky enough to be that good, don't know. So anyway, I think I had it good. I think somewhere between the ages of 16 and 25, I think I wrote some good poems, which is odd, because when I would swap notes with other poets, when I was much more involved socially with other poets 15 years ago, say, they would be surprised that I would say things like that, or that I'm working on a poem. I'm re-editing a poem that I wrote when I was 22 that seemed pretty unusual. But I think, and the reason I think it was so good, I'm not saying I was a genius or I was throwing off everything I was writing was amazing, but I think it was the unpreconceivedness of the thing. I wasn't overthinking anything. And for good or ill, what happened with the creative writing course that I went on, which I will try to kind of reserve for another time, is that you conceive of the thing as a societal contribution that might even have monetary or publishing value in, and some of that can be invasive of the poetry itself. So you have to be careful. And I think that's particularly where I had a bad patch. It wasn't anybody's fault or any particular teacher's fault. It just happened. So I would say the early stuff was good. So basically, if I was to look back, I would say there were 3 stages generally. And that would be the early stuff. It was, see, that's the funny relationship between, when you read a book of poems, if anybody's a reader of poems, and you notice this, you have that section in a collected poems you always see. It's called juvenilia. And sometimes they stick it at the end of the book, or sometimes they put it at the beginning. And when you go into it, you go, well, these aren't the big poems that I'm more interested in. But let's have a scan of it anyway. I always find that interesting. I like the juvenilia as well. But I don't necessarily like reading biographies. I'm a big biography reader. I don't like reading the childhood of most people. Isn't that odd? I don't know. I skip ahead, Maybe I might skip a few pages if I'm in the biography of somebody and I'm not really interested in their childhood. But the juvenilia poems is kind of interesting, like the crap poems of Sylvia Plath or something. Well, what's that about? Crap poems can be interesting as well, I suppose. But anyway, I think it was whatever. Whether I deemed what I was doing at that age juvenilia, you don't consciously obviously do that, but it wasn't a serious thing, and that's useful. Don't be serious. Be serious about what you're doing, but don't be serious when you approach a poem. Just have it as like washing up or doing the dishes or combing your hair. It's like it just has to slide off the psyche without any conscious impulse. Like, oh shit, I gotta write a poem about this. I have to write a poem about this thing that's happening in the world. Everybody's talking about it. I must put my point of view. Over time, I mean, I've written poems like that probably, but over time, that doesn't do much. If I go back and read that kind of stuff that I've written. So yeah, the early stuff was good, interesting. It was without forethought. the middle part would be somewhere between my mid-20s and my early 30s. There's another video I want to make about conspiracy theory or alternate theories of politics and global politics. I think that came with the third stage, and the middle stage, like I say, mid to late 20s. I was involved in a creative writing course. I wouldn't keep a lot of that stuff. Some of it was okay, but I was thinking of being a guy on a stage reading to the adoring hundreds, or the adoring. It would be the adoring hundreds in England. You're not Akhmatova, with lots and lots of people watching you. But anyway, there was this idea of almost like a profession, an office, but it would be, the published poet declaring poetry to the converts. I mean, I don't necessarily have a problem with that if they're good. But I think when that vision of yourself enters the way that you begin a piece of writing, you're on a wrong one. you're on the wrong track somehow. And then I moved to Korea. I moved to Japan, and then I lived in Korea also through the noughties and all of the chaos of the 9/11 world, post 9/11 world, and the Iraq War and all of this kind of thing. And then I came back here to do a course in creative writing. And then I think some time after that, maybe a couple of years after that, the mojo kicked in again. But it was much stronger than when I first discovered poetry. And that's the track I'm on now, I would say, broadly speaking. So you would have certain markers for each stage. For myself, sorry, you say you. I would have certain markers, certain totem poems from each stage that I can look back on and possibly publish or possibly not. And in a way, that third stage is in some way a return to some aspects of the first stage, but hopefully better, hopefully readable, or at least innovative. I'm a bit nervous of that word. Or a form of growth, spiritual growth, or something of that nature. So a return from the third to the first, kind of a renewal, maybe. And I'll speak about that a little bit more, just to clarify. I gave up on buying poetry magazines. For a long time I was reading poetry magazines. If you're a writer watching this, then maybe you'd have a roster of poetry magazines that you read. I'm very much out of the mainstream of thinking now, so that even the poets I'd be appealing to, they would also probably not be buying a lot of established poetry magazines. I might talk about that in another video, but am I getting off track here? I guess it's just background for that third stage that I was talking about. I gave up on buying a lot of magazines. I think politically the government funded anyway. The problem with publishing in general, whether it's a magazine or a book, or a poetry collection in England or any country probably, is that you're really under the thumb of guys usually who are 20, 30 years older than you, who have a very different vision of the world and a very different definition of what poetry is. And for a while, you're in communion with them to the degree that you want to chat to them and possibly get a book published. And for me personally, that didn't happen after a while. I don't think the poetry was necessarily awful. And that's the other thing. It's a very delicate issue because you just think you're a crap poet, if you're doing it for 15 years and you can't get. And I have been published in lots of magazines over time. But I just thought the whole framework for poetry publishing, in the sense of magazines, it's so limited. It's so provincial. I think I agree with being regional. I agree with having provincial or regional references in poetry, but I think I'm talking about a mindset here, which I just couldn't hack after a while. So then other little, and then so you've got this general survey over time when you're studying magazines like that, and so then a few little bits and bobs throw themselves onto your horizon, which are of a much greater standard. And one of the magazines that I thought was of a much greater standard was the magazine The Black Herald, which was being published out of Paris. I hope it still is, but I'm not sure it is. They were publishing collections. But I'm mentioning it just because there was a couple of pieces that I got published before I kind of gave up on publishing for a while. And that would be those poems, or at least the poem Angelology would be the kind of demarcation point between the second and third stage that I'm in right now. I don't know how useful stages of one's own writing are useful, and perhaps it's of no interest to you really, because you haven't read any of my work, so I don't know. But maybe it's useful in a broader way, just in terms of looking back on your own creativity in whatever field and trying to come to terms with what was useful to you and what was not. So that is a little monologue, or a longer monologue, on what got me interested in poetry, and how it's been a constant. And hopefully I do intend to have a book out fairly soon. But I've, like I said, been out of poetry publishing for 9-10 years. So I've had a long period where I've just gotten more into what I'm doing without any social interaction, almost zero. And I have a few friends that I interact with on social media, but very few. I could say maybe one or two. It's a very solitary path, but a great one. I mean, Rilke had a period of 7 to 9 years when he self-professedly wasn't writing anything. I don't know if he wasn't writing anything, but he definitely wasn't publishing. And I think a lot of these things, like with music or poetry, and don't be afraid. I'm not saying you don't publish. I don't want to discourage anybody, but there are times when you don't need to. There's times when you do. What is it? Pound again. A time for speech and a time for silence. So yeah. So I hope that little trip through my growth has been useful to you, and I have a number of other topics that I'm going to make videos on, so let's see what happens. But I think that's enough for now on that one. Okay, take care guys, bye. So